I'm so delighted to welcome you to our annual meeting today. My name is Rebecca Lee, and I'm the Executive Director. It's really been an exciting year for us here in 2020, but I really wanted to recognize what a changed year it's been since we met with many of you in DC, and the challenges that we all continue to face during this pandemic. We had plans to be with many of you in Europe and to meet with many of our Japanese colleagues in Tokyo. But due to this global pandemic, we recognize that many of your families continue to be affected by this, and we really appreciate your time today. In my talk, I'll be providing a very quick overview on where we've been in our last 2 years, having just passed our 2-year anniversary, and where we're going, as well as summarizing our very exciting agenda for you. I'll start off with a snapshot of our most frequently searched terms on the Vivilly platform. We see some drug names as well as some diseases, but not surprisingly, we see that coronavirus is our most frequently searched term on Vivilly. We have many of our institutional members having exciting drugs in COVID-19, so that is by far our most frequently searched term this year on the Vivilly platform. By the numbers from launch to today, we have approximately we have doubled the number of trials, or more than doubled the number of trials that has actually been shared on Vivilly. And then we have tripled the number of participants that the trials represent that is being shared on Vivilly. And then we have really increased the number of institutional members that are sharing through Vivilly. On this slide, we're very grateful for the data contributors that have entrusted their data to us and that are sharing through the data sharing platform. So we have a very diverse group of members that are sharing. We have industry members as well as foundations and a number of academic institutions as well that are sharing through us. We also have a number of academics that are sharing through us that are not institutional members. Some interesting facts, figures, and metrics from our second year. We have over 200 submitted requests as of today. A quarter of these have been requested for more than one member. And then you can see the number that have received approval and those that have not yet been approved. We have data from most of the members that have been requested. Most of these have had data requested through them. And that we have 372 trials that have been accessed involving 345,000 participants. We bridge to several data sharing platforms, and this concept has actually been very fruitful for data sharing. So these platforms include Project DataSphere, Critical Path, and the 2 NIH data sharing platforms, BioLink, which is the largest cardiovascular data sharing platform, as well as Import. And all of these have received requests throughout the year. Most of our metrics are summarized in the BMJ Open publication that has recently just come out, and you can see that below. So if we drill down a little bit more, we can see what types of secondary research are conducted through the platform. Most of that is considered new research, so this is all coded by researchers that come into our request form. Some of that is they code as preliminary research or participant level meta-analysis. Some of that is summary meta-analysis, and a significant less proportion is coded as confirmatory research. We have 18 therapeutic areas covered by the request proposals on Vivilly, and even though this is a broad distribution of therapeutic areas, there are some areas of concentration. So we can see there are concentrations in the area of cardiovascular, neurology, oncology, and rheumatology, as well as pulmonary. So really a breadth of diseases, but also a concentration in certain areas. And as we go to the top 40 requested studies, and how you can read that is, for example, there are 3 bladder studies that have been among our top 40. bladder cancer studies that have been among our top 40 requested studies. So it's not surprising that among our top 40 requested studies, that really reflects what you're seeing in the therapeutic areas. So in terms of oncology, rheumatology, cardiology, these really resonate in terms of our top 40 requested studies that really match the therapeutic areas as well. We also have a smattering of others that is also in our top 40. We really focused, not surprisingly, on the COVID pandemic. That's on the top of everyone's mind this year, of course, and we created a Covet Portal. So this is a portal that makes it much easier for researchers to search specifically for COVID-19 trials. It provides a dedicated search function, the availability for fast-track review and sharing. Many of our partners have fast-tracked their review through this portal, and a waiver of all fees to share, archive, access, and analyze COVID-19 trials. We have 2 partners that have agreed to waive their anonymization fees through these partners, and that is specifically important for our academic partners, but also holds for our industry partners as well. Future directions we're looking at is really to increase our partnerships and collaborations with foundations, journals, and academics. We're trying to expand our training resources library, so we have a training sub-team that is right now looking at putting together a training resource that will be available over the next few weeks in terms of the supporting documents, which will be a great resource for our researchers to tap into, and then to build our list of available COVID-19 data. What I'd like to do next is recognize our Vivilly team. So if they could turn on their cameras. Some of them are behind the scenes, but many of you will have interacted with them almost on a daily basis. And I really will give them great credit for helping keep the platform running, answering user support issues, and all sorts of other items in terms of the platform support, strategy, and managing projects. So Julie Wood and Stan Newman, our Director of Strategy and Operations, if you could raise a hand and show people where you are. Ida, I'm not sure if she's on yet, but Amrutha Bhaskaran, Amrutha's on the end for me. Lewis might not be on today, but Liz Graham, our Clinical Data Coordinator. Gabby Regan, our Project Coordinator. Gabby's. Bobna, our Cloud Support Engineer, and Alexandra Franklin, our Executive Assistant, as well as Marcia Levenstein, who helps us on the stats side. I'm really delighted to have a great team supporting us all. Thank you, team. In terms of our annual meeting agenda, we have 2 panels that'll be kicking us off. The first one, I'm really proud to say that we have a number of researchers that have made great strides and impact in their fields this year that will be presenting and moderated by Marcia Levenstein. So they'll be talking about some of their data, and I think that'll be a real treat for us to hear from them and the value that the data has brought. The second panel will be talking about cross-platform sharing, and also one of our Vivilly Pioneer Award winners will be talking about his data and the cross-platform sharing and how that actually works. And then we'll be wrapping up from talks from Georgina Humphreys and Steve Kern from the Wellcome Trust and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, data sharing in the time of public health emergency, a really important topic, and we really look forward to hearing from them. And then closing remarks from both Mike Stevens, our board chair, as well as our board members that could make it here today. And then we'll close with a time of informal networking with all of you who will be able to speak to some of the panel members that could be able to hold back, and hope you can stay for that if you're able to. Next, I'd like to recognize our award winners. You know, when we started Vivilly, we thought that we would give out awards through both those that could make it to the first publication, as well as those that had the first set of proposals approved and made it to the analysis stage. So John Fu, that you'll hear from today, a prolific author, was named the Global Data Sharing Innovator with the first publication coming out of Vivilly, and he's since had several. And then our Pioneer Award winners that had the first set of proposals going through Vivilly and then went to the analysis stage. So I'm really delighted to be able to announce who those are and recognize them here today. Next, I'd like to ask Koichi Tamiyasu here to talk about Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma. So Koichi, if you could come and turn on your camera and talk about Mitsubishi and why you'd like to join, that would be great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So hello everyone. I'm Coach Tomiyasu, Head of Project Management in Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma. Let me introduce my company briefly. So Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma is a Japanese company which headquarters office is in Tokyo and Osaka in Japan. And we have been conducting clinical studies in the US, EU, and Japan to obtain the approval from regulatory authorities worldwide. In the US, we have subsidiary company Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma Development America in New Jersey, and they manage the development activities of global studies. So our major areas are central nervous system, immunoinflammation, diabetes, kidney, and vaccines. Via clinical trial data sharing, Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma would contribute to accelerate scientific progress and improve public health. I look forward to working with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I mean, we really wanted to have one of our newest members speak because we're delighted to have a contingent of 5 of our 29 members from Japan. And it's really wonderful to be broadening our diversity in Asia and to be hearing from you, one of those companies in Japan. So thank you so much, Koichi, and really honored to have you join us. Thank you so much to be able to hear from you. And I know it's late for you in Japan, so really thank you very much. So next, I'd like to invite Marcia and to come on and talk about the first panel, the Vivilly project experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's my pleasure to introduce. You getting feedback, right?
You sound fine.
Okay, good morning. It's my pleasure to introduce the speakers for the next session, the Vivilly project experience. I think this is the most exciting session since we will hear from the researchers who completed research projects using Vivilly's platform and process. The first speaker is John Fu, MD, the winner of the first Vivilly Global Data Sharing Innovator. As Rebecca already said, he won this award for the first researcher to achieve a peer-reviewed publication based on a Vivilly research project. He was at Rockefeller University when he conducted the research, but now he is currently at Liverpool Hospital as a lecturer at the University of New South Wales. He'll be followed by R.G. Veronicki, PhD, a biostatistician and epidemiologist who is a member of the Vivilly Pioneer Award-winning team. She is at the University of Ioannina in Greece and collaborates with both the Imperial College London and St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. The third speaker is Jane Larkindale, an executive director for the Rare Disease Cure Accelerator, Data and Analytics Platform, and the Duchenne Regulatory Science Consortium at the Critical Path Institution. Each speaker will speak for about 8 minutes, so we have time at the conclusion for their talks for questions from the audience. Please enter your questions in the chat throughout the presentations, and we will ask them at the conclusion. I would now like to introduce John Frew.
Thank you very much. So my name's John Frew. So thank you very much to Vivilly for the opportunity to give a talk today. So basically, I'll give you a bit of a brief rundown in terms of what our research is involved. And we were very lucky enough to be able to have the opportunity to look into this not so rare disease, hidradenitis suppurativa, which is a bit of a mouthful, but we call it HS, which is a chronic inflammatory skin disease that causes a significant burden on individual patients and their quality of life and has very limited effective therapeutics. One of the major issues in the field generally is that existing clinical trials have very high placebo response rates, and it's uncertain as to whether the reason for this is due to trial design, due to outcome measures which are used in the disease, or whether it's due to natural variability in the fluctuation in terms of the severity of disease, or whether the outcome measures have a direct role. And that was something that we hypothesized, and that we approached Vivilly in order to reuse some of the phase 3 clinical trial data in order to explore these particular hypotheses. So the next slide, please. So essentially what we performed was with the kind approval of AbbVie, who conducted the initial phase 3 Pioneer study. We basically performed a number of different analyses which resulted in a few different papers which were very important to the field in terms of future trial design and how future trials are conducted, seeing as there have already been a number of negative clinical trials which have failed in their primary outcome, primarily due to these high placebo response rates. So the initial analysis we conducted basically demonstrated that the placebo response rates are highly dependent on the outcome measure, and that when using different highly validated outcome measures which are continuous rather than dichotomous variables, the placebo response rates can reduce in these particular studies from up near 30% down to a more comparable level in other skin diseases to around 12%. One of the other major contributions which we've been able to add to the literature in the field from this is that we've been able to quantify for the first time the natural variability in untreated disease by having a look at the placebo arm of these trials, and basically demonstrated that there's quite a high degree of natural variability. So this is probably a minor contributor to the placebo response rates in the disease, but has very large implications for the design of future clinical trials. We also were able to identify some pharmacoepidemiological variables that have a high prediction as to what subgroups of participants have a positive response or the greatest response to some of these interventions as well. So overall, the analysis of this data and reanalysis has really enabled us to dive deep into the data sets here and really value add to the field generally, and really help explain some of the primary issues in clinical trials in other therapeutics in this disease, and really inform future trial design. So sorry, just the next slide. So again, the challenges were basically acknowledging that the external validity of the findings were limited, but we could certainly, through having the individual patient data available, really look and describe what populations the data analysis were relevant to. But we're already finding that that some of the publications from this are already having an impact in terms of how current clinical trials in the field are being designed and amended and redesigned, and not only to help aid in appropriate trial design in this disease, but also in identifying clinically relevant outcomes that are also statistically robust to identify new targets in this disease. So again, just as a wrap up, we cannot thank Vivilly enough for all of their help and support, and to enable to have this platform up and running, as it's really expanded and contributed to the field in terms of this inflammatory skin disorder, and also to the sponsor of the initial trials AbbVie for allowing us to have access to the data as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I'd now like to introduce Argy, please. Oh, sorry, I thought you were done.
Hi, okay. So, hi everyone. I'm very pleased to be here today with you. So I'm going to present our project that is about the comparative safety and efficacy of cognitive enhancers for Alzheimer's dementia. And this was an individual patient data network meta-analysis. Next slide, please. So we have no conflicts of interest in relation to this presentation, but this project was funded by the CHR Drug Safety and Effectiveness Network. Next slide, please. Great. So Alzheimer's dementia is the most common type of dementia, and there are several effect modifiers such as sex and disease severity that may impact on the patient's response to the medication. And our aim was to examine the comparative effectiveness of and safety of cognitive enhancers according to the patient's characteristics. So we aimed to individualize the management of the patients with Alzheimer's disease and to fill this knowledge gap for decision making. Next slide, please. So we conducted a systematic review and we identified 9 different treatments, and we included 8 unique studies in this systematic review. In this network plot, you can see the evidence, the flow of evidence of the systematic review that we have identified. So each different node represents the different treatments, and it is proportional according to the number of patients that was included in the specific treatment, and each edge corresponds to at least one study that compares the treatments that it connects. So you can see here I have highlighted with different colors the studies that the edges that are informed by different the different type of studies, by studies with individual patient data and aggregated data, or studies that are informed by only aggregated data. So I have also added the values, the numbers actually of the studies that we have included in each of the different treatment comparisons. And in a parenthesis, we can see the number of studies with the individual patient data. So you can see that the majority of the studies that inform this systematic review and this network meta-analysis that we conducted later on are informed by aggregated data. Next slide, please. So in total, as I said, we included 80 unique studies, but we also included 16 companion reports. So in total, we have 96 studies that we contacted the authors and the sponsors of these studies in order to obtain the individual patient data. Of the 96 studies, we were able to obtain the individual patient data for the 14 studies. However, 2 of the studies were not eligible for the network meta-analysis, and this is because one study did not report any data on the treatment group, and the other study did not report the outcome data. We only had data for the patient's characteristics. So the 12 studies that we included in this systematic review and network meta-analysis with individual patient data, 2 of them were sponsored by AbbVie and were available through the Vivilly platform. Only a single study was not available by AbbVie. Next slide, please. So these 2 studies compared donepezil versus placebo, and both included where we were able to obtain data on the MMSE and the serious adverse events outcomes. Next slide, please. And if we can also press next. Great. So donepezil and donepezil plus memantine were the treatments of the network meta-analysis that showed that were the most effective treatments and improved MMSE, the MMSE score importantly. Next, please. When we conducted a subgroup analysis, for the network meta-analysis, we found that for the participants with moderate to severe cognitive impairment, a larger improvement was observed for the donepezil and memantine alone, and their combination donepezil plus memantine. The least effective cognitive enhancer was the oral rivastigmine, but overall, the cognitive enhancers for the specific subgroup were well tolerated regarding the serious adverse events. Next, please. So for participants with mild to moderate cognitive impairment, we found that donepezil and transdermal rivastigmine were most likely the best treatments, but all except for one treatment were associated with increased odds of a serious adverse event. But likely this was not statistically significant. Next, please. So far, the challenges that we encountered during the whole process, first of all, was the identification of the studies, especially for studies that were published before the 2005 and were not, did not have an NCT number, were not registered with the Clinical Trials Board. Then the data ownership, especially for those studies that were co-sponsored by multiple sponsors. And another challenge was that while we were navigating the data, some of the sponsors switched the platforms. So we had to familiarize ourselves with the platforms from scratch. So as you can imagine, since we didn't have the data, the patient level data for all the studies, for all this that were included in the systematic review, and since we had to conduct the analysis through different platforms, a one-stage analysis was not possible as we planned in our protocol. Also, we encountered challenges regarding the software availability. For example, some packages that we required for our analysis from the R software were not available, or some of them were older versions and we couldn't really work on those. Next, please. Another challenge was the time associated in order to conduct the analysis and to have access to the data. And some of the platforms actually provided us, they could provide us with more time when, of course, we could pay for that. A cost that was associated also in some cases when we required some extra information, for example, for the additional medications information, where we had to obtain a license for that. So although we obtained individual patient data from the different sponsors and the different platforms, we didn't always obtain the full information that we required for our analysis. In some studies, as I said before, for example, one study had available data only for the placebo group. Another study had only data available regarding the characteristics of the patients and not the outcome data. Another study provided us with coded values for the follow-up time, so we weren't sure how to judge what was the first and the last date. So things like that were the challenges that we encountered during the whole process. Next, please. So overall, we found that newer studies with a larger sample size and a smaller treatment effect were more likely to have individual patient data that was available. Next, please. Overall, we know that well-conducted individual patient data network meta-analysis facilitate tailored decision-making. Next, please. However, so far, individual patient data is not yet well established in the field of Alzheimer's dementia, so we require more efforts in order to achieve this goal. Next, please. And in this systematic review, we were able to obtain the 15% of the eligible studies, of the eligible RCTs. But the good news is that we were able to obtain extra data, more data on the studies, that these data were not reported in the publications. Next, please. So a big challenge, a big concern probably is the missing data, the dropouts that we have in the Alzheimer's dementia RCTs, and especially when some of the studies are using proper methods to deal with that. Next, please. Overall, our results show that cognitive enhancers with a large treatment effect in the MMSE score are associated with high risk of a serious adverse event. Next, please. And considering a minimally clinically important difference at 1.4, all treatments except for 3 were clinically important for cognition. Thank you so much. And I especially thank all my co-authors that really helped me all this time with this project, and of course Vivli and all the data sharing platforms that made that project feasible. Thank you.
Thank you, Argy. Now I'd like to introduce Jane for the last presentation.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the introduction and invitation to speak. So I'm Janelle Kendall. I work for the Critical Path Institute, and I'm going to talk to you about some work that we've done through the Duchenne Regulatory Science Consortium, and also about the Rare Disease Cures Accelerated Data and Analytics platform. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with some work we've been doing through the Duchenne Regulatory Science Consortium, which is a nonprofit consortium which is focused on developing regulatory acceptable tools to accelerate drug development in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So the Critical Path Institute, for those of you who don't know us, is a nonprofit institute dedicated to building tools to accelerate drug development across various therapeutic areas. But really our goal is always to take tools through pathways that demonstrate that they are acceptable to worldwide regulatory agencies, primarily FDA and EMA, but also PMDA and others on occasion. So the Duchenne Regulatory Science Consortium was set up very much with the focus on trying to accelerate drug development for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And the first major project that we were working on was trying to develop some disease progression models and a clinical trial simulation platform to really inform clinical trials for Duchenne. Next slide. For those of you who don't know much about Duchenne, it is a challenging disease. It's genetic, symptoms manifest in early childhood, and patients lose muscle strength over time. We have a number of different endpoints we use at various stages of disease, and there are 5 of them on the slide. And what you'll immediately notice for each of these graphs is the huge amount of variance. Each of those little circles is an individual observation. And while there are clear trends that patients get stronger in early life, that's just due to development. You expect a 3-year-old to be less strong than an 8-year-old. But then, depending on the endpoint, function is lost and the patients decline over time. So you have a phase in disease where people are getting stronger, and a phase of disease where patients are getting weaker and losing function. And we wanted to model these changes, which are very nonlinear, and understand the variance, so that when you did a trial, you could choose the right endpoint, the right population, the right number of patients, the right length of trial, so that if your drug worked, you'd actually see statistical significance. Trials in Duchenne have basically never met significance in terms of endpoints in the past. There are drugs that have been approved, but the data has always been messy. And this is what we really wanted to work on, was to understand how the disease changes in patients, what causes that variance, how we can choose the right populations of patients. Next slide, please. So we came up with some fairly complex statistical models. We did what we do at CPATH all the time, and we submitted to both FDA and EMA our plans for regulatory endorsement. That's through the qualification of novel methodologies at EMA and the fit for purpose pathway at FDA. And they came back, they gave us feedback. They said, this is a great idea. We largely like what you're doing. At this point, we had, I think, 11 data sets in our data set that we were going to use. But one of the pieces of feedback we got specifically from the EMA was that we validate the models we were building in a European, or primarily European data set. We had at the time, as I say, 11 data sets that we were using. They were primarily US-based data sets. And we had to go out and find additional data that we could use that were primarily collected in Europe. And that's when we got in touch with Vivilly. They had access to 4 different data sets that were not entirely in Europe, but largely in Europe. And we worked through Vivilly to access those data sets, which we've been using for model validation. And our final regulatory submissions are currently underway. We should be submitting within a week or so. Next slide. So here's a picture of all the different data sets we were using. The problem with rare diseases is data sets are small. So the ones in blue at the top are the ones we already had before we got into this validation stage. And then the ones in yellow at the bottom are the ones that we access through Vivilly. And you can see we have a mixture of clinical trial data, placebo-armed clinical trials, natural history studies, various clinical studies, and such like. And if you click again, you can see how all this data added up. So in our initial model building data set, we had 1,139 patients or 24,000 observations. And then in those additional 4 data sets, we had an additional 364 patients and 2,656 observations. So by the standards of a rare disease, this was a lot of data, which is what's needed to develop these kinds of analyses. Next slide. So you can click again. This is just some graphs showing that validation where you can see, I think it's not actually on the graph, I think the solid lines are the original model predictions, and then the dotted lines are what you see in the validation set. And you can see our models held up pretty well in the validation data set. And then on the right, you can see various subgroups of patients based on the covariates we included in the models. In this case, use of steroids. And again, the models held up quite well. So that pleased us, and this is why we're going forwards with our application to EMA for endorsement of these models. So this was great that not only had we managed to build these models, we managed to validate them in an entirely external data set, and we're confident that these models demonstrate, in this case, the North Star ambulatory assessment and how it changes over time and some of the variables that affect that variance in the population. Next slide. So that's just one case example of what we do at CPATH. I'm going to very briefly touch on another project that we're also working on called the Rare Disease Cures Accelerator Data and Analytics Platform. And this is a neutral, independent data collaboration and analytics hub, really around about sharing rare disease data and making sure we can understand and use rare disease data. So the data sharing, we have a lot in common with Vivilly, and that we really are all about trying to get data out there and available to people. And we have, in addition, the ability to integrate data, as we did in the Duchenne example, and make that data available through an analytics hub to promote really using that data. Next slide. So this is an image of what we have, data coming in, various curation and ontologies and standardization and such like to build these integrated databases, and then various interfaces where users can come in and really understand what data we have, an interrogator to understand the data, determine what's in there, how it could be used, do some basic statistical analysis, an interface where you can pull out the subset of data you want, and what we call the Advanced Analytics Workbench, which allows you to build these kinds of tools, as we've just been talking about for Duchenne. Next slide. Actually, you can click again. But one of the major issues in rare diseases is the fact that the data is limited, and we really want to work with the entire community to really bring data in together. And this is where we've been having a lot of conversations with Vivilly. You can click one more time. And the idea that we've been throwing around is that Vivilly has some rare disease data, and to what extent it will be possible to share data directly from Vivilly into our platform. Where possible, we can do some standardization, tagging, integrating in the data set. And then if you click one more time, then share that data back to Vivilly, so people on the Vivilly platform could also see those integrated data sets once we've created them, and really just enhance the data, the whole community of data sharing, make sure people can find the data they need, do the analyses they need, work with us through our analytics platform, work through Vivilly to find the data, and enhance the whole ecosystem for rare disease research. And we're working on this as we go forwards, and it's something I know I'm really excited about. And I think it's going to be a really powerful tool in the rare disease community. So I'm very grateful for Vivilly, not only for helping us with our Duchenne work, but also to thinking forwards to how we can improve the ecosystem for data sharing across rare diseases. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. And I'd like to thank each of the 3 speakers, John, Argy, and Jane. I haven't yet received any questions from the audience, so I'll start with a few questions. Please put them in the chat, and I'll ask them as I get them. I'll start with John. So, John, what were the most positive aspects of working through Vivilly in terms of your research?
So I think that the most positive aspects were the ease of the interface. So I think that the access to the data was quite intuitive, and that it was just quite a nice way of getting access to the data itself. So in terms of the applications, justification, and in terms of the interface in accessing the data, I mean, it was all very streamlined, all very smooth. You know, a little bit of upskilling and things like that in terms of, you know, looking through the data and things like that, but certainly it was a very, very streamlined process for such a large data set. So that was really one of the most positive things about it. So it was a very good experience overall.
Thank you. Augie, now you had used both individual patient data and summarized data. Was it straightforward to use both kinds of data in your analysis? What advantages or disadvantages did you find in working with Vivilly?
Great. So that's a great question. First of all, I will agree with John that the interface was very, very easy to do all this analysis and to explore the data. But certainly when we want to combine individual patient data and aggregated data, it's something that we have to do outside the platforms. We have to do it in our computers, since we have to combine all this different study data, and we have also to reduce all the individual patient data to aggregate data from each of the platforms and then combine these into one single model. So we had to follow a two-step process instead of a one-stage analysis that we planned in the beginning. So that was the challenge in our project.
Thank you. So Jane, I know you're, as member of Critical Path Institute, you're clearly very familiar with working with data from multiple sponsors that comes in multiple formats. Now you had an aggregated set of data that Critical Path had spent time already harmonizing. As you brought in new data from new sources, were there any particular challenges in adding that data to the data you had at hand?
Not particularly, because we'd already been working with clinical trial data, and we already had mapped to CDISC, which is how we integrate data. I actually think in many ways the data coming out of Vivilly was much cleaner than many of the data types we work with. Patient registry data and natural history data can be a lot messier than clinical trial data. I actually will have to agree with the other panelists that accessing the data through Vivilly was remarkably quick, and I don't think my data managers have ever got through 4 different data sets all at the same time as quickly as they did the data from Vivilly, partially because they'd done some Duchenne data before, but it was really very smooth.
Thank you.
Hi, Marcia. It's Rebecca. Can you hear me? There are some
Yes.
questions that are coming in, and I'm happy to read them off.
Okay.
Do you see them?
No, let me see.
Okay, great. I'm happy to read them off.
Okay.
So one of them is, the one is, for all of you, is, did it take longer to access data than you had initially expected?
So maybe I can start that. When accessing the Duchenne data, I have to say was remarkably efficient. I'd been trying to get that data set for a number of years through the sponsor without any success. We applied to Vivilly, and I think it was 2 or 3 weeks and we had the data. It was remarkably fast. Another data set we're accessing now has been a little bit slower, but I actually think it's been quite quick compared to what I would expect.
Thank you.
And yes, I'd just reiterate what Jane was saying. Yeah, overall, compared to our expectations, we found that Vivilly definitely exceeded those expectations in terms of how quick the data was made available.
I will also agree. Well, we started this process back in 2016, actually, to obtain all the data from authors and the different sponsors. So when we had to move from the different app-based platform to Vivli and obtain the data through that platform, then everything went much quicker than what we did before.
Okay.
Okay, I have a,
thank you.
sure, I have a
Go ahead.
question.
There are. Go ahead.
Okay, I have one
Sorry.
question from Jane from the audience. It came in the questions. So the question was, how do you
Great.
address anonymization challenges in rare disease area?
That is a real challenge, depending on how rare the disease is. A disease like Duchenne, it's a challenge, but so long as you make sure you have no obvious identifiers and you limit location down to a city level, you can anonymize to a reasonable extent unless you have mutation data in there. In the very rare diseases, it's much more challenging, and you may need to cut out considerably more information to make the data truly anonymous. And to be fair, in in the truly ultra rare, anonymization may not be possible if there are only 5 patients in the world.
Thank you. I have another question that's come in. Are competitive concerns one of the obstacles in getting, well, this is more for us companies to share. So this is not really, I don't think, for researchers, but let me see. Those are the only 2 questions I see. Rebecca, do you have more questions?
Yes, once you let, maybe Jane can answer that one and I'll just read the rest.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
The question is, are competitive concerns from the companies make it difficult to access the data?
Again, I think it depends a little bit. I think in our experience at CPATH, when companies see a clear benefit, they're very willing to share data. If they can see that we're going to use their data to work on a tool that will help accelerate their research and their drug development as well. And then the other occasion when I find data sharing has been remarkably easy is when somebody's done a trial, they're no longer working in that space, the trial's failed, then they're quite willing to share the data for more philanthropic reasons. Ongoing drug development programs are definitely more challenging because there is an element of competition. But again, if you can have that conversation about what you're going to use the data for, which will help all companies move ahead, including them, there's a much stronger argument.
Thank you.
So another question that came in is, my company doesn't share rare disease data due to the difficulty in truly anonymizing the data. How would you ensure adequate anonymization in the repository?
Yes, I can take that one.
That's
that
for
one
you,
again.
Yes.
So again, this really comes down to how rare the disease is. In many cases, if we can access multiple studies from different places, and we have enough data, even if it was for data from different periods of time, so data from the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and current data, you can get enough together that so long as you don't go too granular on mutation data or location data or age, you can anonymize the data. But it really, that's a question that has to be looked at disease by disease, data set by data set, as to how well you can anonymize or not. Rare diseases vary a lot in size of population and specificity.
Right.
Okay, I have another question from the audience. Do you have any problems understanding the data received from the sponsors? And perhaps each of you could answer that because you probably have different answers. You got data from different people. We'll start with Argy, maybe.
Can you repeat the question? Maybe I didn't understand it completely.
Sure.
Sorry.
Did you have any problems understanding the data that you received? So, you know, what the variables were, how to use them?
So we had several issues during this entire process, and we had to go back and forth with the different sponsors. That's something that we had to resolve also with them. We first started with between the team, and we discussed all these different variables because initially it was my first time personally that I was exposed to such different huge data sets. So it was really amazing, of course, but surprising in the beginning. So we had to discuss among the team that all these data sets, and then whenever we weren't sure about what its variable represented, we had to go back and forth with the different sponsors.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, so we found that it may have been because the data sets that we had requested were from a single sponsor, but definitely the data dictionaries that were supplied and things like that as part of the clinical trial data were more than adequate in order to analyze the variables of interest. So we didn't have any problems in that respect, which was beneficial.
Okay. And Jane?
So like Argy, we often do end up going back to the sponsors to ask individual questions. We have the advantage that as we're a consortium, we have many of the academic experts as well as many of the companies as part of our consortium. So they're part of our monthly calls. We can ask them questions directly a lot of the time, including often the PIs on the study. But Yeah, I don't think I've ever had a data set we've been able to look at immediately and understand every variable and not had to ask at least a couple of questions of what did you measure this in, what version of this test did you use, those sorts of things. So there's usually a little bit of backwards and forwards.
Okay, so I guess looking at that further, is there any specific information that you found particularly useful to help you use the data above and beyond just getting the data?
I can speak for our data managers that they always love it if they can get things like data dictionaries and case report forms and clinical protocols if possible. And basically, the more information you have about exactly how everything was done, the better you can understand the data.
John?
Yeah, absolutely agreed. Yeah.
And Margie?
I certainly agree. Yeah.
What about the analytical aspects, things like analysis plans, protocols, I mean, other information about the study that's beyond, describing the specific variables? Is there any other information that's particularly helpful? Margie?
Yeah, I would certainly say that this was very helpful, especially according to see what the authors, the original authors, have done, and of course the different names of the variables. But this wasn't always the case. In most of the studies, yes, this was very helpful, but not always. So that's why we had to go back and forth with the sponsors.
John?
In our situation, we were kind of replicating the same process of analysis using different variables, and obviously there were different statistical techniques that were needed, given that we changed from a dichotomous to a continuous variable. But overall, it was more about interpreting the paper and just following the similar techniques. But so useful, but yeah, not the primary kind of thing that we were looking through.
Okay, and Jane?
Yeah, that's probably less relevant to what we do, in the sense that we try and take everything back to the basic measurement before we reanalyze. So the only time that's particularly relevant to us is if they send us a variable that's been interpreted already, so that we can take it back to those basic measurements.
Thank you. And one last question. Have you received data in CDISC format? And in fact, is that a format that you're familiar with and is helpful to you? Or does it not matter if you just get it in the legacy format, if however the sponsor has it? Sorry, Augie, you can, Jane, yeah.
Sure. So because we're always focused on regulatory submissions in the end, we will translate the data or map the data to CDISC if it's not already in CDISC. So certainly we like it if it already comes in CDISC. It makes our life easier and removes a step for us. But if not, we will map the data as best we can to CDISC.
Okay. John?
I mean, yeah, no real preference in terms of my personal opinion in terms of how we worked with this individual project.
Okay, and Ardy?
So I will agree with Jane, and also the difficulty was that we had several different data sets for the one study that we had to combine because we had to work across different outcomes, for example, and to use different data sets with characteristics of the patients. So then we had to match the different data sets that we were provided. So this was something that we had to work on, and then there was some extra information that we didn't ask for, but still, which is okay. Of course, it's fine to have more information. It's nice, but sometimes when you have a lot, you're bombarded with too much information, then you have to find what you are interested in, and so not. So yeah, that was our experience.
Great. So I have one last question I'll ask everybody. So was there anything that was surprising or exciting that you found when you received the data that you didn't expect, received and analyzed the data? Jane?
Well, I know I was very excited that we really needed specific elements in the data to confirm the models we already had And I thought it was going to be incredibly difficult to find a number of European-based data sets that had all of the different endpoints we were interested in modeling, bearing in mind we had 5 different endpoints we were modeling with or defined covariates. And I was extremely happy when I downloaded the data and started going through and realized that all 4 data sets had the variables we were interested in, and we didn't have to go and seek additional data as well, that this really could be our confirmatory data set all in one fell swoop. I couldn't have been happier about that.
Great, thanks. John?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the quality and the depth of the data and the fact that it was, you know, the vast majority was entirely complete as well. That was, you know, a real benefit. Obviously, you know, the fine print was, you know, the data is the data, but just the fact that it was all very complete and all very, very useful, and had lots more areas of interest than we initially anticipated. And indeed, we actually went back with a second request to then have a look at some extra areas that, because of the richness of the data set, we knew we could answer some other related questions that we put in a second request for some further analytical endpoints as well. So yeah, that was a real bonus.
Great, thanks. And Argy?
We were certainly thrilled when we received the individual patient data, because our experience was that first we started with the authors and we received non-individual patient data from them. So after going to the sponsors and the data sharing platforms, we're very excited that finally we got some data. So that was amazing for us, because this is Vivli and all these platforms made this project feasible to us. So that was amazing.
Great. So I'd like to thank all the speakers, and congratulations on all the great work that you've done, accomplished. We're happy that Vivli has been able to help you get to your goals. I'm now going to turn over to Ida Sims to chair and moderate the next session. Thank you very much. And we will be around at the end of the presentations for an informal networking session. If you have additional questions, you can call in then. You can remain on the line and talk to the presenters and other members of the Vivilly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Just amazing to hear this experience, and so glad to see science moving forward in a way that I think we've all wanted for so long. So we're going to move on to our next panel, which is on cross-platform data sharing. One of the things that's really distinguishing about Vivilly is that we work very closely with our partners, and we're really bridging all the players that are dedicated to the sharing of participant level data. So we're going to dive deeper into both the challenges and opportunities of that, and thinking about where we might go in the future with cross-platform data sharing. So with us today, we have 3 amazing panelists. I will start off with Vivek Rudrapatna from UCSF. He's one of our Vivilly Pioneer Award winners, which means he's a trailblazer. He's one of the first 10 approved data requests on Vivilly. We're also going to hear from Carly Childers from Johnson & Johnson and Liz Roberts from UCB, both very valued partners of Vivilly. So a reminder again to put your questions in the chat. And yes, Vivek already has his camera on. A reminder to the presenters to turn your camera on when you're presenting. So take it away, Vivek.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much, Ida, and thank you to Vivilly for the opportunity to present this overview of our work. And so briefly about myself, I'm Vivek Rudrapatna from the University of California, San Francisco, and I'm both a gastroenterologist and IBD specialist here, as well as a clinical data scientist. And so in the space of inflammatory bowel disease, or IBD, my particular interest is in trying to figure out operationally as a clinician, how do we select among the different treatments that we do have available in our armamentarium to treat our patients? So at the present time, there are 6 FDA-approved drugs for moderate to severe Crohn's disease, which is one of the IBD subtypes. But these drugs, although they've all been are demonstrated to be superior to placebo in clinical trials, they've never been tested head-to-head, at least in the Crohn's disease space. And so the question that we asked ourselves about a year and a half ago when we began this journey is, can we reuse the raw data from the clinical trials that were used to obtain approval for these drugs in order to complete a individual participant level data comparative effectiveness meta-analysis? And so this was the approach that we took. What I'd like to share with you in the next few slides are some of the challenges that we addressed and sought to overcome in this process, and hopefully in the process of that inspire some questions and lively discussion to follow. Briefly, the challenges that we faced with this project are outlined at the very bottom bullet point here, that we sought to obtain trials that ultimately came from a variety of different biopharmaceutical sponsors, and so it required essentially buy-in from each of the data contributors to allow us to use their anonymized data for this purpose. We also had a variety of, you could say, methodological challenges, which involve differences in the design of these trials that make it challenging to answer this kind of question using these data, and also the problems of missing data, which arise in various varieties. Next slide, please. So to speak more concretely about the trials, we initially performed a search of clinicaltrials.gov looking for phase 2-3 studies, randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled studies of drugs that have been FDA approved for the treatment of Crohn's disease, and in particular, those that involve a assignment to active treatment at the current FDA approved dose, which is to say, not other arms that were related to, say, dose finding. And so following that process, we obtained a total of 27 studies, and then we kind of narrowed our scope further to identify trials for which we would be able to assess the endpoint of clinical remission following about 24 weeks worth of treatment, which is a benchmark or a time point that we decided on based on clinical practice. And so we narrowed the scope down to a much tidier list, you might say, of 10 trials corresponding to the drugs listed here. And so what you can see in this table is that the trials were all essentially sponsored by different biopharmaceutical sponsors, each of which essentially has kind of generated and supported the development and release of each of these compounds listed here. And so what you can see in the rightmost column is that when we began this process back in 2018, each of these sponsors did actually have existing mechanisms in place to allow their data to be shared and reused for these kinds of studies. But the challenge was that their trial data was actually available on a variety of different platforms. And our experience was much the same as that of already from the prior panel group on this session. But what we basically sought to do was to reach out to each of these sponsors and to work carefully with the platforms upon which the trial data was hosted, namely Yoda, of course, Vivli, and clinicalstudydatarequest.com CSDR. And so over an extended process of back and forth discussions related to how to make this feasible, we were eventually and ultimately successful in getting all parties to agree to make their data available on a single platform, which, as you can imagine, is truly the ideal analytical environment to do the downstream biostatistical analyses needed for this study. Next slide. I thought I would offer a few tips for navigating this process for those of you in the audience who may be in the early stages of planning out an IPD meta-analysis of your own. So the first tip I would suggest is to start early and to be patient. This kind of dovetails off of the Q&A session from earlier in the meeting. But in our experience, in large part, I would say due to the complexity of our design, our desire to incorporate many different trials worth of data coming from different trial sponsors, it took some time to get everyone on the same page, for everyone to kind of agree with our proposal, our analytical plan, etc. And so what I would say is it's important that prospective researchers come to the table with the right expectations and budget kind of timelines and scheduling appropriately. But ultimately, your patience will be rewarded. So that's one first tip I can offer. The second, basically is my suggestion to that investigators engage adequate biostatistical expertise relatively early in this process, especially during the phase of designing the study and applying for it. And part of the rationale for this is, as you can imagine, these studies are very complex. IPD meta-analyses are, in my opinion at least, a whole lot more complex than meta-analyses based on aggregate level data. And so it really behooves the study team to make sure as early as possible that not only you have people on the team who have adequate clinical expertise to guide selection of studies and the endpoints, et cetera, but also people with adequate biostatistical expertise, ideally expertise with IPD meta-analyses, causal inference methods, et cetera. I think this whole process will definitely speed and make much more streamlined the process of obtaining the data. The last bullet point I thought I would offer here is, although I think it's a common thing for those of us in this field to begin and maybe even end our searches on clinicaltrials.gov, but I would just encourage investigators to take a broader view. So many data sponsors, and in particular I can mention AbbVie, although I think others have platforms like this as well, they have sections of their website where you can run searches for trials of certain criteria based on disease space or the drug name, et cetera. And you may actually find a number of trials that would not be found on clinicaltrials.gov using conventional criteria. And I think this is in part just the fact that the uptake and the use of CT.G to report studies hasn't always been heavily used over the years, and it depends on essentially how old the studies you are seeking as to whether or not these things will be well annotated on a database like that. So I think with these 3 tips, hopefully this will help you on your way for your own prospective studies. So with that, I'll end my section and pass on the mic to the next presenter.
Thank you, Vivek. Next, we will have comments from Carly Childers. And reminder to turn your camera on if you can.
Can you hear me, Ida?
Yes, yes. And if you could turn your camera on.
Great, working on that.
Wonderful. There you go. Hello.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I thought I solved that before I connected. So first of all, before I jump in, I just want to say thanks so much to Rebecca and Julie and Ida and all the folks at Vivilly. It's just a real pleasure, and I have to say it was so exciting to start the day off to hear from the researchers and actually hear the real live stories of the data being used. So really appreciate you inviting us. As mentioned, I work for Johnson & Johnson in the Office of the Chief Medical Officer. I have a largely policy and ethics-based role there at J&J, and one of my main responsibilities for the last several years has been the oversight of the policy side of our clinical trial data sharing efforts and our collaboration with the Yale Open Data Access Project, which is the independent group that reviews all accesses for requests to data and makes independent decisions about requests for them. And I'm partnered closely with Stephen Banford, who I know many of you know, and as he is responsible for the heavy lifting of actually making the data available and working on the difficult side of much of what we've heard today about data utility and anonymization. So in just thinking of these 2 questions that we as a panel were reflecting on as far as what prompted Johnson & Johnson to share data using Vivilly, as I just mentioned, as most folks know, we've been sharing clinical trial data through the YODA project since 2014. And we've been so pleased to see the great uptake in clinical trial data sharing, both through the YODA project and other platforms. And we're super excited that we're coming up on the milestone of 50 publications resulting from data shared through the YODA project. And during that time, I think we've been consistent that we've always been advocates for increasing the reach of data sharing. And we really believe the power of clinical trial data sharing is going to be realized when you have engagement and participation from all sponsors of clinical research. And I think I've even heard some folks mention that already this morning. It's not just the industry. There is so much incredible research done in many places that when you bring all of that together, you're really going to realize the power and benefit of that. And so while the majority of the over 160 research proposals we've seen come through the YODA project over the last several years, we've always had an interest in trying to make it easier to overcome some of the obstacles you've been hearing about multi-sponsor requests. So we were very excited and saw our support of Vivilly as central to that commitment to really continuing to advance clinical trial data sharing and contributing to the ecosystem and providing researchers a way of utilizing the Vivilly platform for multi-sponsor requests while still allowing us, and we really appreciate what Ida and also Rebecca highlighted as bridging to other existing platforms that had already been in place when Vivilly was launched, so that we could still follow the processes and the principles that we've said have been so important to us in launching the YODA project. And I think what has been so incredibly exciting, and Rebecca, it was great to see that slide you put up to see the increasing number of organizations that are committing to share data through Vivilly and seeing all the academic institutions. So I think that's just been one of the really big success stories and why we continue to be excited to be a part of the ecosystem and continue to offer that multi-sponsor option through Vivilly for the data that are being shared by the operating companies in Johnson & Johnson. As far as the three things that I think are most important to ensure data in a timely manner, I think my good friend and colleague Liz is going to. I had a sneak peek at her notes, and I'll just say in advance that I'm going to agree with what she's saying, and I'll take a slightly different tack from a policy perspective and a principle-based approach. For me, I think when we start to talk about making things faster and more efficient and doing things more quickly, I always want to go back and remember that there are people associated with the data, and that as we really strive to innovate in data sharing across a range of health data, to try to think about making an inclusive participatory system that really includes individuals from who the data are sourced in that conversation about how best to get there. What do they think is important? How do they feel about the different utilization of data to, I think, increase transparency and trust in the process? So I would just encourage that as all of these conversations continue to expand about use of data and how to really maximize the utility, that we continue to engage with the people who stand to benefit and from whom we've obtained those data. And I think that will actually speed up things in the policy and legal policy landscape if we do that, as we create more trust in the system. I think continuing to create incentives and obligations for data sharing is critical to that culture, to embrace data sharing and accelerate it and make it happen more quickly. Prioritizing funding, infrastructure, we've seen some recent proposals come out about that, to really support data sharing and not just make it a commitment on paper, to actually think about things like a platform like Vivilly and other obligations to create avenues to data sharing so that these hopes, dreams, and obligations that are out there actually can come to fruition. So that incentive and obligation, realizing and funding natural infrastructure is important from my perspective. And I think what has been interesting from the public health emergency is to really build on past successes and lessons learned, so that in times of crisis like this, we're prepared to take on the challenge, but also leverage the experience we already have and maybe not recreate the wheel, so that we can move more rapidly. I think we've learned so much over the past several years, and especially recently with the launch of Vivilly. So I think convening groups like this is so important, to hear what people are doing, how we can think about doing it more efficiently. So I really love the culture that Vivilly's created of knowledge sharing and continuing to expand people's awareness. And I would say that in and of itself is really critical to continuing to make sure that we can advance in a timely fashion. So with that, I will turn it over, I believe, to my good friend Liz Roberts, who will come on and answer a similar question.
Indeed, thank you, Carla. Liz?
Thank you very much, everybody. Really excited to be here. Thanks so much, Carla, as well. So yes, same two questions. So for me, why Vivilly? I think it's really its breadth as well as its depth. We all know it's got a huge number of clinical trials available. That number is growing all the time. But also, if we think about who are the contributors of those trials, I think Vivilly's got the richest source of data, because it has so many contributors from an academic background as well as contributors from pharma. And I think academia and pharma, we have a lot we can share with each other and learn from each other. And I see Vivilly as being a great community through which we can identify value drivers for data sharing. how we as a community can keep moving forwards, advancing science, and also improving people's lives. So very excited to be part of the Vivilly community now. The next question, I found that was a real toughie to just reduce it down to 3 things. But in the end, I went with the 3 themes of transparency, standards, and increasing our community. So transparency is an obvious one. There's no point saying you're going to share data if then researchers can't find the data. But if we think beyond that, researchers, once they found a list of trials, they need to really understand them. So I think we have an opportunity which we can socialize within the Vivilly community of what is it researchers need to know when they're trying to put together their proposal, so that they know they're including in that proposal all the trials that are in scope, and that they're not adding in others that they're not sure, and then it turns out that those trials don't meet their specification. So obviously, as data providers, we need to be responsible. We need to be mindful of personal data. I completely 100% agree with Carla. These data belong to real people. Yes, we have applied data protection methodologies to either further pseudonymize or anonymize the data, but ultimately these originated with real people, and we need to always remember that and make sure that we are mindful of that, as well as protecting company confidential information. But I'm sure there's progress we can make in what we can share early on and publicly, so that researchers can more easily find all the trials that meet the specification of their desired research. The second one, anyone who knows me knows that standards is a passionate topic for me. And I want to break that down into 2 sub-themes. The first, as we've mentioned before, is that there are multiple platforms out there. And in some respects, I know researchers don't care which platforms things are on, they just identified their trials. But when it ends up that they're on multiple platforms, it adds to the complications of being able to co-host that data. And I'm really excited by the bridges that Vivilly has been actively trying to build with other platforms, because again, we need to make sure that researchers can access all the data that they need for their desired research proposal. But also on the topic of standards, if we think about the individual trials, as we know, many pharma use the CDIS standards, though whether the versions have changed over time or the interpretations of different sponsors may be slightly different, there is a great consistency for CDIS formatted trials. But again, from a research perspective, if I was a researcher, I would dread trying to assimilate trials that had very different structures. And so I think anything we can do to further standardize and have uniform structures can only be helpful from a researcher perspective. And then my last thought was really everything comes back that data sharing should be the gift that keeps on giving. We've had people be in clinical trials, those data are now being shared with others. Those researchers really need to complete the process and be strongly encouraged to publish the results of their analyses, whether that's a positive result, a negative, or inconclusive. Whichever way it is, there's knowledge that can be gained from those trials. But again, I like to flip that back to the data sharers, to the contributors. We know that sadly a lot of research proposals don't make it all the way through to publication. And I do know that's not lack of willing on the researcher's part. So what are those obstacles that unfortunately too many researchers are still hitting? Is it the time it's taking for the process? Is it that when they get the data, it's hard to navigate? It's not what they thought it was going to be. Was it even the right trials? Or other unknown obstacles? Because I think the more we can talk with researchers and understand from their perspective, then the better we can be as contributors, and the more research proposals can make it all the way through the process, so that we can increase scientific knowledge from the trials that are shared. And I'd like to end by, again, just acknowledging the COVID pandemic as well. We all did things a little bit differently for the COVID trials, and I don't want to go back to how we did things before. We need a new normal. We have the opportunity for a paradigm shift. So again, I would love to come together, and that the Vivilly community is a great place to do that, that we can really analyze, what did we do differently with COVID trials, what was of benefit, and how can we use those approaches with other areas of unmet needs, such as rare diseases, so that we're really maximizing the useful data that we can share. So with that, I will pause and I will hand back over to Ida.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz, Carla, and Vivek. If all the speakers can please come back on and turn on your camera. I need to do that myself as well. Here we go. All right, we're in our Zoom collaboration here. Thank you so much, everyone, for really bringing up some really interesting and important points. And I want to take off on a comment that I think all of you have made, that this data really is from real people. There are real people behind the data, behind the trials, and Liz reminds us with the COVID pandemic going on that this is not a pure and abstract effort that we're engaging here. It's really one that's central to us as a community, globally, and I think. Vivilly, what we do to increasing transparency and trust with patients is super important, and I think we need to start there. And we do have a question that picks up directly on that one. A question specifically to Carla, but I would obviously welcome everyone to respond to it. And this is from Steve Kern. When I was an academic investigator, I asked patients that directly and universally got a responsive one, where people wanted the maximum insight gained from their data. That's why they were participating in the first place. And I see a lot of nods here. Do any of you see that differently, or is there any kind of pushback from an alternative view? Because often we hear things like privacy, privacy, privacy. How do we really engage it? I think there's a real passion from the people involved and from us to really move data sharing forward. Can any of you, all of you, respond to that?
And maybe I'll take a crack at it first. And Steve, I promise I didn't pay you to ask this question, but it's actually one of the subjects of my thesis I'm working on as I'm wrapping up my master's in bioethics. So I'll thank you for the opportunity to react to it. And I think you're right. I think we traditionally hear, well, as long as you take care of privacy, everything else should be okay. And I'll very openly say I don't think that's the case, and I think we're hearing from people that not only do they want us to maximize the use of their data, and absolutely they want to see benefit from it, but they want us to do it responsibly. And I think you're hearing from people that they want to be able to feel like the value is coming back into the system for them. So I think you are starting to see more people engage more directly and wanting to understand, if we are talking about innovation, benefits of data sharing, and all these new innovations coming out, how do I, as an individual who's participating in that ecosystem, see and experience the value coming back to me? How do I find out what's happening and things like that? So I do agree. I think Steve and Michelle Mello and colleagues did some interesting research a couple of years ago that talked about people's perspectives about what, how they feel. And most of them were like, yes, we would like to share our data, but we want to make sure it's used appropriately and responsibly. So from a J&J perspective, taking off my personal hat for a moment, I think that's why we felt the role of the YODA project has been so important in looking at the research proposals and making that independent assessment that there is a public health need, that it's somehow going back to generalizable knowledge and advancing science and medicine. So I would say there's important stewardship obligations along the way, as privacy may be more difficult to either guarantee, but I think that obligation to continue to make sure the benefits flow back to the system are also important. So let me stop there, though, because I could go on for days and let my colleagues chime in.
Comments from anybody else on that question?
Maybe if I go next. So on the technical perspective, there's obviously multiple legal bases under which we can share data, and consent is just one. But regardless if you're using consent as the basis for which you're doing your secondary sharing or not, there's obviously an ethical mandate that in the informed consent form of the original clinical trial, you need to explain to the people considering that trial what your plans are for secondary sharing. Speaking from my perspective today, I've never received a request for a person to have their data deleted. But we've had requests before for people who, once they've left one of our trials, they wanted to go to a different sponsor's trial, and they wanted to get hold of their screening data again. There's often some really nasty tests that have to be performed on people, and so if we can reuse a test, if it's fairly recent, then that's obviously very nice from a person's perspective. So we've been happy to fulfill those requests so that the person could go on to other treatments.
Great. We have a question. I think I want to build on this obligation and opportunity to our patients and really address the question of community that we want to increase the reach. I think several of you have talked about that to make sure that the gift that keeps on giving. And the question is the availability of clinical trial data through various data sharing platforms common knowledge within the academic and the medical community? So Vivek, first to you. And how did you find out about Vivilly, and how we can get the word out more?
Yeah, I think I saw an article about Vivilly perhaps in one of the, I think Nature, or one of the associated journals in the Nature family. That's actually how I first heard about some kind of a news story when it first came out. And prior to that, I basically had been working with YODA and CSDR to get some of the trial data, and others essentially didn't have existing partnerships with a data sharing platform. And so that's how I heard about it. And so certainly people who are in my kind of research neck of the woods, they all know about it because I talk about the work that we're doing, and they'll find it's been eye-opening and exciting to them that these kinds of resources exist. I think people don't generally know that it's possible to get access to the raw data like this. And so, how can we kind of increase awareness of these resources? I think as the performance of IPD meta-analysis becomes more common, and I think as more of these studies get published and get presented at conferences, et cetera, that's of course one major venue whereby others can learn about it. Yeah, I would say that's the obvious one that comes to mind.
Great. Yeah, I think there's more work to be done, certainly in getting the word out. And thanks to all of you who've done some exciting work, because that's really the message that comes across, is the great science, and it's not, not us talking about, the organizational stuff as much as that is critical. Let's see, we've got a couple of other questions. I want to pick up on the theme of incentives and support. I think it's both, the push and the pull for people to both deposit data and to use data. And we have some incentives, but not as many. Let me go to the next question, where addressing some of the barriers to aggregating specifically across different repositories and different trials. A major problem is that as trials are spread over multiple repositories, heterogeneous data transfer and data access policies, wouldn't it be a good idea to work on harmonization of procedures and process across repositories? And I think that is what Vivilly does. How about the harmonization of data across certain domains? And we've heard from the panel this morning, heard from from Vivek and Crohn's. Is there, and this is sort of getting to the future of data sharing, is there possibly the prospect of certain domains getting together, defining common data elements around this notion of data sharing, so that the gift can give, keep giving? And any comments on that, and in particular some potential domains or lessons learned from domains that have tried to harmonize on a set of common data elements to facilitate data sharing and data aggregation.
So I'll make one comment that I would love to hear Vivek's perspective as a researcher, but I think we have gone back and forth as far as proactive preparation of data. To what extent do you try to anticipate whether you can combine things? Is it what the researchers are going to want? And I think we continue to experience and have the belief that it should be driven by the scientific community need, like trying to guess which data sets to put together We had an interesting project where it was working on, I'm probably going to get it wrong, I think it was treatment-resistant depression. And the researchers identified a bolus of studies that would be meaningful to do research on, and they got together and did that, what you were talking about, that harmonization, aggregation. And I think those types of approaches where the researchers and the scientists are saying, this is what we think is interesting, I think that could have some value. I think us trying to guess which of our data sets could be put together might not be as productive. But Vivek, I see you nodding, so I'd be curious to hear your perspective as well.
Yeah, I just want to echo the sentiment that's already been shared, which is that efforts to improve the harmonization of these data for secondary reuse purposes is definitely an extremely valuable goal for researchers such as myself. And I think the ways in which the harmonization would ideally be done would kind of fall into two categories. One is kind of a better understanding of the variables themselves. And I know the prior panel, they discussed some of the nuances related to documentation and data dictionaries and such. And as you can imagine, with a variety of different contributors, in our personal experience, we found the documentation to be kind of uneven. That made the meta-analysis challenging. But that's kind of one aspect of it. And then the other aspect I would say is kind of related to the appropriate analytical approach for even replicating the original results as they were published in the original manuscripts and publications. These trials, at least in our world, are quite nuanced, quite complex in design. There's a lot of subtlety, lots of things that don't really end up in print, but are require a level of expertise that goes beyond the press, if you will. And so the extent to which it's possible, for example, to have even like the analytical code that was used to analyze the data in its raw form and come up with the results as they were presented, these kinds of things would be helpful. Of course, these efforts to make the data more usable, at least the retrospective or the historical data that's been collected to date, it takes a lot of effort, time, resources. It's not free for sure. And perhaps there's kind of a question of to what extent is it worthwhile to spend that time and effort on the pre-existing trials that exist in given disease areas versus just going forward, for the major parties that are participating in this space, perhaps in conjunction with the regulatory agencies for which they're planning studies, essentially define the standards upon which data is collected and analyzed, and kind of seek a harmonized approach going forward. I think these are the kinds of the questions that will have to be decided.
Mm-hmm. And if I can maybe add as well, some exciting work that's coming out of the COVID R&D Alliance right now, and I know Steve Kern, I believe, is on the call, the Gates Foundation, Alliance Workbench, a number of sponsors and the collaborators have been working together to define a data dictionary, but on an aggregate level. So again, researchers can come in and kind of get that information to really identify what trials are doing what, to really help with what endpoint would be most helpful to select in future trials. So I'd be really keen to have kind of a broader dialogue and see if that could also be translated into other areas of unmet need.
Great. I think that's a very good forward-looking note to pass on to the next panel. I think data sharing, we've been struggling with the closed access, managed access, open access models. It's all about how to get at the data. And now I think we're, having passed that step, now I think you've all raised some very interesting and important directions for a community to work together on the value of the science and collaborating really around the science, and again, bringing in our patients as well. And let's not forget that. So let me now turn over to back to Rebecca, I believe, to move on to to our next panel. Thank you so much, everyone.
Absolutely. So next we'll move on to Georgina Humphreys and Steve Kern. So Georgina, I'm really delighted to be able to introduce these next two speakers to talk about data sharing in a time of public health emergency. Georgina, we're going to pass the baton to you, and hopefully you'll be able to flip your own slides.
Okay.
So, hopefully that'll work for you. And you can do that yourself. So thanks so much, Georgie, and look forward to your talk.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks everyone for making this happen. It's strange times, and it's actually sad to see some of your familiar faces there on the videos, because I feel like it would be so much nicer, obviously, to just sit and have a drink together this evening and talk this stuff over. But anyway, at least we can try and connect and talk through some of these issues. So let's see if I can do anything. Oh, okay. Okay, I'm going to take you back first to a time which I know seems like a distant memory, but it did exist pre-COVID, just to take you through a bit of context on what the funders have done over the last few years. And I think it enabled us to be in a position to build on all of the previous work and act, I think, quite quickly when we started seeing these first cases coming out of China in early January. So pre-COVID, the funders, I think I can speak for Wellcome, but I think this is true of many other funders, have been committed to ensuring research outputs from the research that we fund are managed and shared in ways, of course, that maximize human health benefit. But of course, the question is always how to realize that commitment and make change actually happen, which is what we've all been talking about already today. And one thing, of course, that the funders can do is have policies in place. So Wellcome have had an open access policy, as well as a specific data, software and materials sharing policy in place for some years. And in fact, even within those policies, there are some extra expectations that are already written in there for sharing of research which is related to public health emergency at the point when that research is going on. So this already all existed pre-COVID, but in fact we also additionally had these specific statements around data sharing related to Zika in 2016 and then Ebola in 2018. And we worked with a group of cross-funder group called GLOPIDAR. For those that don't know, it's about global preparedness for epidemics. And we agreed, again, this is a couple of years ago, on some key principles on data sharing in public health emergencies. So there was really quite a lot already in place when COVID struck. And let's try and go back. And then building on, as I say, those statements that we had already from Zika and Ebola, and this is where Steve Kern starts to say, oh, not another discussion about data sharing in a public health emergency, because I mean, the question is always, did those statements really achieve great success in changing behavior? But if anything could shift behavior, we thought maybe COVID could do it. And so we Wellcome coordinated a statement at the end of January of this year, which has been subsequently signed by many, many organizations. And it's specifically targeted publishers particularly, but also funders and researchers directly. And it really talked about making the underlying data associated with research as widely and as quickly available as possible. And for the publishers, talked about getting those data sharing statements into all of the articles that they published that were COVID related. Now, it's worth saying that we are looking at commissioning, collecting evidence on the impact of this statement. What did organizations actually do subsequent to signing? Did they introduce new policies? Did they change their processes? Did it result, of course, in actual changes in speed of development of therapeutics and vaccines? These are the kind of questions that would be exciting to ask with a bit more time to accumulate evidence. But what we can look at, first of all, now is these data availability statements, just as a kind of indicator of maybe what's gone on this year. And I think this is quite interesting. I'm going to share with you some of these numbers. The slides will all be shared, and I've got links in there to the exact pull code, so you can update the numbers whenever you want to, if you want to keep monitoring this. This comes from Europe PMC, which has full text research articles ingested related to COVID-19. Thanks to an extra bit of grant funding that we gave them so that they could pull all the COVID-19 articles in and everyone can access those fully for free. And I've pulled, this is just a few days ago, last week, I pulled all COVID-19 tagged articles that are available in Europe PMC. This is research articles, so that doesn't include reviews and editorials. And that comes up with just over 62,000. And I hope you'll agree that it's a less than overwhelming 9% of them, that small little blue slice, that actually have a data availability statement. It's not even filtering for the quality of that statement, it's just having any statement at all. And maybe even slightly more depressing is that 23% of all research articles that were published in 2020 available in Europe PMC have a data availability statement. So this looks like if it's a COVID article, it's less likely to have an underlying data statement than if it's just any article. And just for completeness, I also just put in the small numbers, but that we have in our own publishing platform, Welcome Open Research, and Gates have their own one too, where our grantees can publish for free, and it's an open peer-reviewed journal. We're doing a little bit better there with 87% of the only 52 COVID articles so far having data availability statements. So, you know, this is where we are right now. And why do we care about that? Well, I'm sure I don't need to explain to everyone on the call about why we care about it, but at least here's the example that's most famous, of course, from this year, is the Surgisphere article in the Lancet, which then, of course, got retracted because of questions about the underlying data. And I think it's an example, I mean, I'm pulling out Lancet here, there are others, of course, I could have cited, but I think it's an example of where the Lancet had signed the statement that we coordinated at the end of January, and it wasn't until after this paper that they actually changed some of their policy and processes, internal processes, to get those data sharing statements correct and really do some additional checks. Which the positive of which, of course, is that now those are in place. But, you know, we had to go through that to get there. And I don't want to make this sound glass half empty, because I think, as we've all been hearing today, COVID data are available. So I think there is a positive part to this story. There's been a massive amount of work done over the last few months. And here's just a few selected places where you can get COVID data of all different types. There's obviously thousands now of viral isolate sequences available, say through the COVID-19 data portal there on the left. And of course, we have Vivilly for now some of the clinical trial data that's coming out from COVID studies. So there's data available. There are systems in place. Oh no, sorry, I'm taking you to the COVID data portal. Let's see if we can just go on to the next slide. Okay, so what can funders do? As usual, there's no silver bullet, although very exciting news, of course, this week about a vaccine. There's never going to be one answer to how we sort this out. And it comes down to a combination of approaches. This has already been nicely discussed already today by others. The sort of supporting and encouraging, and the mandating and requiring. And I think funders can sit covering both of these areas. Welcome for many years has made it clear, I think quite clear, that we cover costs associated with curation and preparation of data and listing on repositories and fees and so on associated. But surprisingly, we don't see a lot of researchers include those costs in their upfront plans when they apply to us for grant funding. So, you know, it's encouraging people to cost those. I think one thing we've learned through this pandemic, though, is that we need to support infrastructure and tools. And that's like, for instance, the Vivilly platform, but it's also about building in credit mechanisms that people who share can be credited back, and that there's ways of citing the reuse and so on. And Steve's going to go and talk more about the Research Data Alliance, which we're supporting too. And I think, of course, there's a place for institutions in all of this. Welcome are requiring all of the institutions where we fund researchers to meet the principles of DORA, which is about assessing researchers in terms of rewarding with tenure and career progression. And so it's about making sure that those people that share get real benefit from sharing, and that's recognized. And then, of course, there's always the place for mandating and policies, which I've talked a bit about. And with respect to our COVID-19 funding initiatives, we've really stepped up in terms of adding some grant conditions that are specific about being much more detailed from our expectations of our grantees to say, where are they going to share? When are they going to share? How are they going to share? What's the managed access route? Tell us up front, think about it right at the beginning, and then we've got something to follow up with them later on down the line through the project. And I think that's me. Always welcome to have a chat. I haven't mentioned at all that we act as a secretariat for the independent review panel that many of the Vivilly members use. Always happy to talk about that if anyone would like to contact me direct. And with that, I'll hand back to Rebecca or straight over to Steve, whichever's the smoothest. I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Yes, right over to Steve. Thank you so much, Georgie.
All right, good morning, Georgie, and thank you, and good morning, Rebecca. Good morning to all, and thanks for inviting me to present today on behalf of both the Gates Foundation and then the COVID Therapeutic Accelerator, which had funded an effort called ICODA, which stands for International COVID-19 Data Alliance. And this is essentially a program that's started off out of Health Data Research UK as a way to essentially coordinate across platforms. And we heard a comment earlier about the barriers to sharing data across platforms and the difficulty in being able to do that. So as an approach to try to resolve some of that, rather than say, oh, we want to actually have the repository or the location, instead let's work with a number of the ones that are existing that are strong, like Vivilly, and see what we can do to leverage the opportunity to combine data across those. So let's see if I can. Great. All right. So, as we all said, key challenges to data sharing in COVID-19, and Georgie made the comment about, me lamenting another data sharing statement. That was mostly a lament of my own organization because we've had them out there, but we haven't been very good at policing them, nor at helping to support our grantees to actively make sure that they are data sharing, and that's starting to change. And that's one of the things I'm seeing as a positive coming out of this COVID crisis. But the challenges are the ones that we all know, right? There's a lot of misunderstanding in terms of about the disease. There's lots of data that's being collected, and there's lots of data being shared, but it's fragmented and it's in a number of different places. It represents these, data archipelagos, as I like to use a phrase here shown in this lovely exotic picture. And so the idea was, could we build something that would help connect these islands together and bridge between them in a way that could be useful? And the challenge that we've seen is that it's really difficult to do in the midst of a crisis. So as I was saying before, it's deja vu all over again, to quote a famous American philosopher, that here we are in this crisis, everybody's gathering data, but nobody has the capability to actually start to put the data together to try to make some sense out of it. So we've undertaken a task of doing that with the idea that it's not just built for COVID-19, but actually I think to the point that we heard our colleagues, both Liz and Carla mention, that there's a new normal starting to emerge in how people are thinking about data sharing. And we want to take advantage of that thinking and that opportunity to say, okay, let's define what we want the data sharing world to look like after this pandemic for the future. So one of the things that ICODA is not, it's not a repository. It's a digital research environment, or what's called a DRE. And it essentially is set up to enable people to pull data in from different sources and bridge across those. And it's working in three different manners. So if data is open, you can bring it into this workbench or this environment, the digital research environment that's been set up, and work with it directly there. If it's protected data, you can also bring it in, and you can actually have it be locked up in a place where only people that are essentially approved can get access to it, and you can keep the data in a safe environment for analysis with collaborators across the globe, actually, and put it into something that, in essence, the platform calls an airlock. And it's got all the auditing capabilities and all the functional needs to meet GDPR and HIPAA compliance when that's important and that's necessary. And then the third way that you can operate with this platform, and it's run by a small company based out of Scotland called Iridia, is in a federated approach. And I think that's one of the directions that I'm really excited to see if we can move towards and push towards ourselves. You see this happening in all of the other areas where data is shared, except for biomedicine, right? And I think biomedicine, because of the whole privacy issue, becomes really challenging in terms of how people think about federation. But in fact, federation is a way to solve that problem, because instead of having to move data around the world to put it together into lakes and big repositories, you can leave it where it is and you can send the analysis out to the data instead. Now, you know, it sounds really easy, really technically challenging to do, but actually being overcome on a regular basis now. And certainly one of the things that's been interesting for us in this collaboration of the Therapeutic Accelerator, and you see the partners listed on the bottom of the slide to the, I guess it would be your right or your left side. MasterCard is not usually a researcher in the biomedical domain, but they do an awful lot with data privacy, particularly around financial transactions. And we're learning from them about the role of data trusts and organizations that can actually be set up to be the ones who meet GDPR compliance and serve as a role of controller for shifting data through the environment in a safe and regulated way. So that's, I think, one of the challenges that we find is that all of us have this desire to make data available and to share it, and then we get stymied by the barriers. They're real barriers. Some of them are technical, but most of them are things related to doing things safely and following rules and guidances. And so, you know, ways that we can start to lower those barriers by learning from other industries, I think is going to be really important. So at the center of this alliance is what we're calling the Analysis Workbench. And it's, as I said, it's an environment. It's a research environment. So we heard an earlier comment, I think it was from Areti, about the meta-analysis challenges and having to work in platforms where they didn't have the right version of R, right? So this is essentially a space where you have software that's available. It's all provisioned to the latest versions for analytic software, but you can also use your own software. You can use it essentially as a virtual space and run your own code on it as well. So there's a lot of flexibility to be able to essentially enable the sharing of data and to pull it in, particularly from different sources and different repositories. And you heard Liz mention also this effort that we've been doing with the pharma companies in the COVID R&D research space, where we've helped to identify with them a common set of data standards for aggregated data. So at least to do aggregated level meta-analyses and to collect data in a consistent way, we're able to actually facilitate the ability to compare across different kinds of therapeutics in treating COVID. So to the point that Vivek is trying to do with Crohn's, you know, I think we're proactively trying to enable that going forward, because everyone is realizing, particularly in the repurposing space, that, you know, we're really just trying to look for any solution that can mitigate disease and help people get better. It's not necessarily the same component as if you're developing novel therapeutics purposely going forward. So this workbench allows you to discover data, to request access, to analyze the data, to have that access be federated when it can be, and to collaborate. And a key component of this is the collaboration. So as funders in the global health space, ourselves, welcome for sure, we oftentimes hear from our partners and people that we're working with in low-income countries, their frustration in trying to be good data sharers, because what they find is data sharing, what we call data sharing, they might call data stealing, right? So they give us the data and we do the analysis and then tell them what to do as a result of it, rather than really sharing, partly because of, you know, how do we enable them to have access and be a full participant? And so this is a workbench that's really meant to help facilitate that and keep the Southern Hemisphere as well as the Northern Hemisphere fully engaged in this effort. And of course, COVID being a global pandemic, there's really no reason why people from all over the world can't collaborate on solving some of these problems. So the key element of this is built on a governance structure. We've spent actually a lot of time on getting the governance right. And again, because we don't anticipate that this is going to be a resource that goes away when COVID slows down or dies down, we would actually like it to transition into something that defines that new normal, as Liz mentioned. And the key is that you have, safe people, so you have trained and accredited researchers that are using the data in a trusted and appropriate way. So you have to have some process for vetting who wants to do what with the data and make sure that it's documented and everyone understands what's going on to maybe get away from the problem that Georgie just mentioned in the Surgisphere example. That you have safe projects, the data are being used for valuable and ethical research that's delivering a public benefit. And you can do that then in a setting that provides the right safety, the data is kept in the right components, and then the outputs essentially go forward. And one of the things that we anticipate will be left behind, or the artifacts that will exist on this workbench, are the outputs, right? The reports, the summaries, the codes, the scripts, so that they can be used again, the data dictionaries, right? So that rather than us having to reinvent this again at the next crisis, we're building from where we left off, because it's not unreasonable to anticipate that we're likely to have to deal with these kinds of global challenges in health in the future beyond COVID-19. So who do we hope will benefit from this? Actually, everyone who's involved in the arrangements, right? From regulators, other repositories, researchers, funders, professionals in healthcare, and the public and patients and policymakers. So partly we're trying to engage with all of these stakeholders so that they have some engagement and some understanding of this kind of a data alliance of what can happen with this. Because I think, again, as we've heard from others this morning, this is an opportunity to start to essentially move the needle, if you will, to the new normal that we would like to have once this pandemic slows down. So what might this look like to an organization like Vivilly? Well, the COVID Therapeutics Accelerator that Gates is part of, along with Wellcome and many others, has funded studies to deposit data in Vivilly. One of the things that we've started to do at the Gates Foundation is to help do assessments of clinical trials in particular that we're funding. And then early on at the front end of the study, rather than at the back end of the study, define the data storage capabilities, where the data is going to be deposited, what's the structure of the data, what it's going to look like. Because if you do a clinical trial simulation to plan for an upcoming trial, you actually already have the data structure in place. So you know the kinds of questions you're going to ask. You know what the statistical analysis plan is more or less going to look like. It might morph a little bit over time, but you basically have the structure that you can start with on the front end. And when you do that on the front end, it's a whole lot easier. So here you see a bunch of studies that were funded at Therapeutic Accelerator, where our intention is to have the investigators deposit all of their data from individual trials in Vivilly. And you see one there, Stanford, U Toronto, with a question mark. Those are actually two investigator-initiated trials around interferon gamma that produced opposite results. And so the investigators are curious to understand why that happened, and we're working with them to essentially help them get their data to Vivilly to be left in the Vivilly repository, and then let them work on it together. So that's one of the things that we're starting to see is this great opportunity for people to want to use resources and repositories like Vivilly to continue to move forward. And then, from the workbench, users can define what we call a driver project that could use data that's held in Vivilly. And then we can figure out the right appropriate ways. If it's summary data, that's relatively straightforward. If it's individual subject data, then we have to make sure that there's an agreement in terms of the characteristics of the data so it can be handled safely in the workbench. And so depending on the data use agreement, either open, restricted, or federated access from Vivilly, we're also starting to explore. So the key thing is that the data provider can maintain controllership from a GDPR perspective, and essentially be able to feel like that data is being used in a way that's safe, it's auditable, it's traceable, and there's a strong use for understanding from it. So with that, I will leave my contact information following off of Georgie's slide. That was a great idea. Thanks, Georgie. If anyone wants to reach out and discuss further with me, and happy to take some questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Steve. That was really terrific. Any quick questions for Georgie or Steve? And hopefully you can stay for the networking session.
One thing I am noticing is that even though Georgie and I are sitting on opposite sides of the world, we're in about the same level of light in the day.
Light. I was thinking the
Yes,
same thing.
yes, absolutely. And you know, one question I had for you is, have you seen you know, researchers approach you directly for this funding, or have you been outreaching to them for these funding opportunities? Are they hearing about it through the normal channels that you know, I've seen a lot of the outreach that you've been doing, but have you been you know, outreaching through the normal channels that you have for these funding opportunities?
Yeah, I'll say at least on the Gates side, one of the things that we've done is we've gotten a bit more aggressive, if you will, at reviewing the clinical trial designs. And in that process, it gives us the opportunity to have this question right up front. And then, as Georgie mentioned, you know, that has to be planned for in advance when the grant award is being given. And so we're having those conversations up front with people about, here's what it's going to cost for you to put this into Vivilly, or here, you know, here's a list of a half a dozen places you could choose to put your data. And these choices, we know what the costs are, and we're happy to budget for that. You could also, you know, hold the data yourself and make it open and available, but we have no idea what those costs are, so you'd have to cover them yourself. And it's interesting because as you present the options to people, they kind of go, oh, okay, that makes sense. Great. All right, we'll use this one, right? And so we're not in a place where we want to force everybody into a single repository, but at least make them aware of the options and facilitate that, because ultimately that helps put all of the data in a place where it can be used again.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much. Really wonderful talks that tie together, and it's good to see you two working together. Any other foundations that are working closely with you on this effort, or a plan to harmonize and bring together other foundations in with this effort?
Go ahead, Georgie, I'll let you talk to that one.
Well, on the COVID therapeutic accelerator, we had from the very beginning MasterCard, as Steve showed, I think, and CZI and Mindaru have also been very supportive of the Alliance Workbench. So that's one area. I mean, more broadly, you know, there are lots of other funders, and as I mentioned, GLOPID-R, something like GLOPID-R is a cross-funder group. So there's various other funders that sit on that, which is more about aligning our guidance and recommendations for, you know, all different grant holders that are maybe being funded. And then also I should have mentioned probably the work of the RDA, the Research Data Alliance, which has just recently produced some very nice clear guidance. It's very detailed. There's a big document of like 143 pages or something, but you can pick out the bits that are relevant for you, and talking about repositories, trusted repositories, what funders can do, what researchers can do. And that was a real global effort. There was a working group that 600 odd people fed into. So it's really nice to see COVID drive those kind of efforts in coordinating standard guidelines and recommendations that can apply for then all sorts of data going forward, as Steve said, hopefully well beyond COVID.
Wow, terrific. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to move to the next segment, and I really thank you so much. Just as, and if anyone else has questions, we can certainly take them. What we'll do is we have a couple more segments. I'm going to turn it over to Julie from AstraZeneca, who's joining us as the newest member, and then we'll be upgrading everyone so that you can chat in the for the virtual networking session before we do closing, after we do closing remarks. So Julie, welcome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. I'm Julie Holtz-Oppel, and I'm the head of Clinical Transparency and Data Sharing at AstraZeneca. And I'm happy to announce today that AstraZeneca has become a new member of Vivilly starting this month. We do this and continue to pursue and advance our data sharing commitment with researchers in support of the FPN Pharma Principles for Responsible Data Sharing. So AstraZeneca has been sharing data with researchers for years, and over the years we've received hundreds of requests for clinical data and worked tirelessly to share as frequently as possible in support of good research, ensuring that we're following legal and privacy laws globally. This is not always easy and it's not always fast. And we're committed to continuous process improvement opportunities for data sharing. And this is one of the main reasons that we have joined Vivilly. Watching Vivilly grow into the data sharing platform of choice for researchers over the past couple of years, it's become clear to us that we wanted to be part of this consortium. Vivilly offers a simplified request solution for researchers as well as quality tools to support them in completing their research on the platform. We also see simplification in the shared management and contracting processes that Vivilly brings to the table. We enjoy the opportunity to pursue more publications out of the data we share via the collaborations with researchers for Vivilly. And I think this was echoed earlier listening to the presentations from our first panel from John, Arietta, and Jane. It's clear this process is working, and it's exciting to see the number of publications already coming out of this, with Vivilly really being quite young in overall data sharing. We're also really pleased to have the Wellcome Trust IRP as part of our data request review process. This will provide us the independent scientific review for requests that AstraZeneca considers from researchers. We really do believe there's great value when data collected during clinical studies can be safely and effectively shared for further research. We do believe, and I really believe, that this controlled access to clinical data for valid research really contributes to and enables the best progress in advancing public health and medical treatments globally. We really are constantly looking to drive greater transparency, and we believe that by joining Vivilly, we've taken another step in that direction. And we are really looking forward to receiving our first request through Vivilly in the near future. So thank you very much, Rebecca, and back to you.
Thanks so much. I cannot wait till you receive your first request either. I'm looking forward to that. Thank you for joining us, Julie, and to the whole AZ team. Thanks again. Thanks again to all our Vivilly members for your support throughout the year and throughout the years. Thanks again. What I'd like to do now is recognize Mike Stebbins. If you could turn on your camera and introduce the Vivilly Board of Directors. Mike, I know a few of them are here with us today. Mike.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for an extraordinary set of talks this morning. I really appreciate it. We have had just an amazing growth of Vivilly over the last year. And that's because of all of you, both our contributors and members and the people who are using data. On the phone today, we've got Barbara Beyer and Ida Sim and Justin McCarthy from our board. And our board works in concert with Rebecca to keep us on track. And it's been an absolutely amazing year. Thank you, Rebecca, for all of your work. And I want to, again, welcome AstraZeneca to Vivilly as well. It's been great having you join us, and we look forward to working with you over the next couple of years. I was particularly heartened this morning to hear stories about some of the rare disease work. That I think is where we're starting to show just an amazing amount of progress, whether it be HS, Alzheimer's. We heard about muscular dystrophy as well. There were some common themes here that started to pop up on the need for more infrastructure for data sharing, on the need for better standards for data sharing. Just this morning, when we heard about COVID data sharing, and Francis Collins just this morning put out a statement encouraging researchers to share their COVID trial data. So we're moving in the right direction, and hopefully in the next couple of years, we're going to see a tremendous amount of more data sharing from the research community. That's one of our weak points. Is that we don't have academic researchers sharing their research. We're seeing a lot of growth from industry, but we want to see academic researchers also joining Vivilly and sharing their data as well. I think that will be a tremendous boon for the industry and for data sharing in general. With that, I want to pass it on to Barbara and Ida and Justin to see if they have any other closing remarks. But I want to thank you all again for taking the time today to join us and join the Vivilly community. Barbara?
Barbara, could you turn on your camera if you're still here? And Ida? I do believe Justin had to step away for just a minute. Ida, any closing thoughts?
No, just echoing the excitement of how far we've come together as a community and how much further we have to go. But I think all the pieces are in place and a lot of food for thought from our wonderful speakers today. And welcome again, AstraZeneca. It's terrific news.
Absolutely. So, I actually just want to thank everyone for their attendance today and thank our wonderful board who's really sometimes in the background for everyone else, but they've been really wonderfully supporting our vision and mission this whole time since our launch. So I think what we'll do now is we'll upgrade everyone to a panelist so all of you can speak and hang out in our virtual networking session. So if our staff can actually do that, we can just move on to virtual networking. So Julie, could you let me know if that can happen?
Yes, we'll just start. If everyone who's willing to stay could just stay on the line and we'll start upgrading you. We're also stopping the recording now as well. The slides as well as the recording.
Okay.
Rebecca, I'm assuming your chair is not actually on fire. Looks like there's some smoke coming out the back.
Oh, I have a humidifier that helps me with my allergies, but I'm glad I have that look to me. Yes. Such an exciting meeting.
Your safety first.
It's dry ice. No, kidding. All right. So if everyone who is here could turn on your cameras, that would be great. So we know you're here and you want to be in the session. All right, so who would like to ask any questions of our panelists? I know someone wants to.
I'm happy to start us off.
Any questions? Sure, Mike.
I'd love to get a sense from the community and from the panelists on where they would like to see Vivilly expand in the next year or so. We're aggressively expanding in our members, but are there other functions that you'd like to see or other features that you'd like to see Vivilly take on in the coming year? Other activities that you'd like to see in the coming year? Where do you see the biggest opportunity for growth?
I know Julie has some thoughts on that, but go ahead.
I was going to jump in from our perspective. I mean, I think you already alluded to it, Michael, that there's obviously a gap in academics sharing. So we see this great success with the pharmaceutical industry members coming on. And of course, there's been some success in the institutional membership, but we want to see that translate into real sharing from the academic researchers. And I'd love to see if it's about driving them because there are example projects for reuse that will engage people to share because then they know it's going to get used straight away. Then, Wellcome would be really keen to try and support in particular projects. And I know we've talked a bit about harmonization. So if it's about, targeting a particular area, getting some harmonized data sets, driving reuse, maybe that will be the way of hooking people in. But it's not an easy one to solve, as we've found.
Absolutely. And, now that we're drilling in a little deeper, we do see areas of kind of concentration in particular areas. It's, of course, we have these 18 therapeutic areas, and maybe it's more than that. But as I was putting together this presentation and also for our article, there are areas of focus, right, that people are interested in, and maybe those are areas to start with. certainly.
Or maybe.
And Julie, you were interested in imaging as well, right? Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
Not to put you on the spot.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, one of the things that we have been looking at and have had conversations in other forums around is software that supports when we do agree to share imaging and or genomics data. And I know, within SAS, we made some progress for genomics basic software capabilities. Both of these are newer areas, and it's not that we're standing up to say we will always share these things, but I think as science evolves and these become more BAU kind of data that we collect, eventually we are placed in a position where sharing this kind of data along with the clinical data has value and will be something we can do. And so having the mechanics in place to enable that, I see is a great option.
With regard to the academics, I think having federated capability would be a huge boost. We've at CTAP, for those who are familiar with it, we have done a sort of baby version of federating with our collaborators in Europe, and it really helps, especially since GDPR reared its ugly head.
Yeah, I want to address the issue of federated data sharing. While I think is a very nice solution, it works. If the data underlying have a common data model, so when you federate a query across the federated network, that you can map the question or the analytics to the data. And I think that's been one of the major challenges, right? That to get the data sets aligned in such a way that you can federate a query, you can even define a federatable query.
Yes.
That's the real challenge. It's not so much that, and in fact, some of you know that I was on the IOM committee on data sharing, and we started off with the federated data model, and we suggested the federated data model. And as we went deeper in with the Vivilly experience, pragmatically, extremely challenging to do at a general scale. And maybe it is to use particular disease domains, particular institutions, particularly those who are academics, and maybe Georgie to have some funding to demonstrate this, because we can't federate if we're not federating the same thing. So those are interlinked both problems and challenges there.
I think the three that I was thinking of was the cross-platform sharing, and we've got to keep moving forwards on that. As Julie said, that the different data types are expanding to X-rays, MRIs, genomics. There's increasing appetite for us to be able to share those data. But then also, as well as expanding what we're doing, also kind of really solidifying the processes, because there's no point expanding if then researchers don't have a good experience. So it was lovely to hear the really positive feedback from researchers earlier, but there are many who do struggle to get the whole way through the process. So how can what needs to be tweaked so that more are successful, because they will then be our best advocates and champions, telling all their colleagues to come to Vivilly, and data sharing is a fantastic thing. So I think really continuing to work on that will be really productive.
Absolutely. I thought that was a great session. I mean, with Vivek, you and Carla and Ida moderating, fantastic. Jan, did you have any thoughts? Really good to see you here. I don't know if you can hear us.
Hi, sorry, I'm juggling a puppy.
Very cute.
Thank you, brand new and noisy. But I thank you for allowing me to listen. As a clinician who works primarily with children with medical complexity, one of the things that I think about is leveraging a motivator for the academic researchers. And I think rare diseases do that because they can't themselves get a big enough N to do what they need to do. I love the Duchenne, how that was approached in terms of just pulling out what are the predictors that matter. But almost everything I work with is rare. And, you know, when we're looking up 20 kids with rowheads to figure out what to do this morning with a kid, if you guys can figure out how to get that available, they're going to have a vested interest in accessing your data. They're not going to necessarily do it, especially with rare diseases, because it's the right thing to do, because honestly, it already would have happened. And also, there are so few patients. And so I would love to see you leverage it, not from an ethical perspective of right or wrong, but just from the sheer, you can get more papers out if you access it through this way. Just as food for thought. Thank you for having
Jan
me.
has a really unique perspective in being a pediatrician that sees primarily rare disease patients. I really value your thoughts, and thank you for coming.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear your work, you guys. You have no idea, somebody on the front row, how much of a relief it is to hear this work. So the biggest reason I come to these meetings and read everything is because it gives me peace of mind when I do work like I did this morning on these incredibly rare things, that every day it's easier to do my work, and every day I can work more on fact than on fiction. And I thank you for your work. If you need happy stories, Rebecca knows where to find me. We use everything you do every single day. So thank you.
Thank you. So Jane, this is why we need to work a little bit harder on our collaboration for people like Jan.
I was thinking exactly the same thing. We've got to make this work.
We're going to make this work. We're going to write you into our case study, and maybe we should do an interview with the three of us and Ida.
Love it.
Because this is really important for children with rare diseases.
And we have families that are more than willing to help with your narrative. There's stories to be told. And you know, when we first met, it was really striking to hear people who didn't work in this area of rare diseases to hear the privacy issues. And I loved hearing the ethics come up. That's how we met. But yes, when you're facing critical illness, you're not so worried about privacy. You want advancement to keep your kid alive. We have a lot of those families. So please leverage their stories to motivate academicians to do the right thing. So thank you. I'm going to turn off because my puppy's noisy.
But very cute. Thank you, Jan. Gavin or Elisa, do you have any thoughts?
You know, I mean, I've really enjoyed the conversation today, and you know, I just want to say, Julie, you know, it's good to see AZ joining as well. I'm really pleased to see that. You know, I think you know, Vivilly have gone. This year's been remarkable, the amount of companies and organisations that have joined. So it's really good to see you joining here as well. You know, we've only been in it for 3 months, but yeah, I mean, I think the conversations were really interesting, and the data privacy one is one which challenges us a lot. You know, we have certain things within Roche which are common to other organisations around how we share our data, and one of the things that Vivilly offers us is that secure platform. But you know, when you hear the stories about actually how do we make data available, this is what we're all here for. It's not because you know we thought you know we have a whole lot of data and resource that's doing nothing. Let's try and put them together and give this data to somebody. You know, if somebody would like it, that'd be great. No, it's not about that. It's really about how do we advance the science. You know, and those challenges are very real. You know, I mean, you know, we moved from CSDR. We're still friends with them. We've still got a few projects in there. But, you know, this challenge about how does data move easily and seamlessly across platforms, you know, particularly in rare diseases, the things that CPath does, I think is really interesting. You know, there's not a lot of this data. So, you know, pulling this data together is really important. So how do we ensure that as we build these platforms, we don't build the walls so damned high that nothing can get out? You know, it's hard enough getting it in, but you know, how's that challenge going to be met? And I think that's something which isn't just a Vivli question, it's not a CSDR question, it's an industry question and a partnership question. And I think the idea about how we build trust, that's where it needs to go. You know, we've got agreements with Vivli because we like what Vivli does, but I'm also conscious that if the world goes into, you know, these silos without really challenging itself, then we haven't really answered the question effectively to the patients that we are charged to sort of advance the science with. So that's something which does bother me. I like the idea of federated data, you know. Everybody understands the value if we could only just program it and build these data sets the same, you know, how much easier it would be. And everyone's, you know, in these large pharma companies has spent millions on projects trying to harmonize their own data. You know, if you don't believe me, we have a whole great big project called EDIS where we are looking at our legacy, and everybody else has their own version of it. You know, I think what Novartis is something 42, you know, and I'm sure AZ, you've got yours. So everybody knows how hard that is, and I can't imagine for anybody dealing with data coming from a number of organizations trying to federate that data and be able to run simple queries across a pooled set. But, you know, it's things that you're doing, Georgie, to actually encourage you know, researchers and actually making money available. Funding for that is critical. You know, we've run projects in Roche where we've done, you know, ophthalmology, and we reckoned that roughly about 70% of the overall project wasn't on the analysis, you know, it wasn't on the machine learning, that it was actually on the data wrangling. And that always seems weird to people when they see this or they talk about it. Oh, how the hell can it be so hard to wrangle the data? Well, anyone who's ever been, and I was a SAS programmer for 20 odd years, anyone who's ever done it knows that actually the data manipulation is massive. And it only becomes more so as you start pulling across multiple studies and then across multiple sponsors. So, but it's a great ambition, and you know, one that I fully applaud you for, and CPAS trying to sort that out. And the last one that I thought was also interesting, the one that Liz mentioned around the modalities. You know, we're seeing a lot of interest, not just in our clinical trial data. We're getting asked regularly about our imaging data or omics data. And that's really, really difficult just now for us. Because these are high value assets within organizations. You know, setting aside the sheer data privacy, you know, I mean, clinical trials is difficult on the data privacy, but it's manageable. But it gets more complicated when you start chucking in omics data, you know, those levels of conversation become much more challenging about that. And imaging data provides its challenges as well, not least of all because people go and burn literally into the image at times. Patient identifiers. Sorry, there's a who in the background. So I think all of these things are really interesting to hear. Other people struggle with them as well. I don't have the answers to them, but I'm very interested to help us find ways to answer the questions better, not only today, tomorrow, but as we work together to see what we can do. So I'm going to go back on mute because it's quite noisy. I apologize for the noise.
Thank you for your comments, Gavin, and we absolutely are looking into all those modalities, and that's you're not the only one who's brought those up. But thank you.
I just want to add, well, first, thank you, everyone. Yes, it's been a very interesting and enlightening discussion all morning. So thank you to all the panelists for bringing that information to us. And it's getting me re-excited. I mean, we had a little bit of a delay in getting started, but looking forward to 2021 starting soon, and looking forward to getting our data out there. And Jen, thank you for your comments, because that kind of hits home. We work on rare diseases at the company that I'm at, and there we have pediatric patients and stuff like that. So I loved your comment about, you know, they don't care so much about the privacy, they want the information. So looking forward to being able to provide more of that. Yeah, thanks everyone. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you so much, Elisa. Mike, any thoughts or others?
I was going to ask.
I know there's others on the phone. Go ahead, Susan.
Oh, I just wondered
Susan?
if I could ask a question of the drug companies represented here. I think I know most of you actually. You're clearly doing, if you like, the right thing in sharing data to the Vivilly platform, but I am curious in what you're looking for in terms of your own use of the data that's in Vivilly.
Question.
Gosh, I didn't mean to silence everybody.
Susan, I would answer your question, but I don't have a response yet because we haven't started using the platform yet. So I think that's maybe a question I'll be able to answer better next year.
Thanks, Alyssa.
Yeah, sorry I can't be more helpful.
Rebecca, you were looking for people on the phone, I think.
Yeah, and just to answer your question, Susan, we don't get a lot of requests from pharma for pharma data. It's an exceedingly low percentage. We do have a few, but not all that much. And people on the phone, I don't know if you have any questions. Some of you are on, but may not have your cameras turned on, which is totally fine. But if you have any questions, certainly do feel free to chime in. Great. Mike, any parting words of wisdom?
No, thank you. I really do appreciate the comment that someone made about patients and what they expect. Patients are routinely shocked that there's not more data sharing, that their data is siloed and that scientists can't broadly access it. And this, obviously, we have got a large group of people who are believers in this. And as we move forward and as policy evolves to require more data sharing, I think this community is well positioned to receive it and make good use of it, and to really lead on the types of infrastructure and standards that are going to be required to make good use of data. But we're off to a great start, and the examples that we heard today really are exciting and fun and are leading the way on the reuse and repurposing of clinical trial data. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today.
Absolutely.
Congratulations.
Well, thank you so much.
So much done.
Thank you. And thanks, Mike, for everything. All right. Take care. That's a wrap. And we'll see you soon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.